You are walking home late at night. A woman in a surgical mask approaches. "Am I pretty?" she asks. What you say next decides whether you live or die. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, Kuchisake-onna. The street is empty, not the comfortable emptiness of a residential neighborhood after dark, but the hollow stillness that settles over Japanese urban districts in the dead hours between the last train and dawn. Streetlights cast pools of sodium, orange light at regular intervals, each one an island. Your footsteps echo against shuttered storefronts and vending machines that hum their electric lullaby to no one. The air is cool, not cold, mid-spring in Japan, when the cherry blossoms have already fallen and the heat of summer has not yet arrived. You can smell rain on the wind, that particular urban rain scent of wet concrete and ozone. Then you notice her. She stands at the edge of the next pool of light, perfectly still, a woman in a beige trench coat, her hair dark and straight, falling past her shoulders. She wears a surgical mask, the kind that was common in Japan long before the rest of the world adopted them. Worn against pollen or a cold or simply a desire for anonymity. She is watching you. And then she moves, gliding rather than walking, closing the distance between you with unnatural speed. Her voice, when it comes, is soft, almost watashi kare. Am I pretty? This is Kuchisake-onna, the slit-mouthed woman. And in the spring of 1979, she brought an entire nation to its knees. To understand Kuchisake-onna, you must first understand the particular atmosphere of post-war Japan. A society caught between the weight of ancient tradition and the velocity of modernization, where the old ways had not vanished, but had instead retreated into the spaces between things waiting. Japan in the late 1970s was a nation transformed. The devastation of the Second World War had given way to an economic miracle that seemed almost supernatural in its speed and scope. In a single generation, Japan had rebuilt itself into one of the world's wealthiest nations. A technological powerhouse where bullet trains connected gleaming cities and television sets brought the world into every home. The rapid urbanization that accompanied this growth had fundamentally altered the Japanese landscape, both physical and social. Rural villages emptied as young people flooded into expanding metropolitan centers. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, seeking opportunity in the new economy. Old wooden houses with their sliding paper doors were demolished to make way for concrete apartment blocks. Rice paddies became suburbs. Ancient shrines found themselves surrounded by highways and shopping centers. Yet beneath this surface of relentless modernization, older currents ran deep. Japan's relationship with the supernatural is not easily categorized by Western standards. The indigenous Shinto tradition, which predates Buddhism's arrival in the 6th century by millennia, conceives of a world populated by kami spirits, or essences, that inhabit everything from grand mountains to humble kitchen hearths. These are not gods in the Western sense, nor are they merely ghosts. They are the animating presence of the world itself, the consciousness that dwells in all things. Buddhism, when it arrived from China via Korea, did not displace this worldview, but merged with it, creating a distinctly Japanese synthesis in which Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines often occupy the same grounds, and the boundary between the spiritual and material worlds is understood to be permeable, even fragile. This permeability means that the supernatural is not relegated to ancient history or primitive belief. It is the presence you feel when walking alone at night, the unease that settles over certain places, the intuition that warns you not to speak certain words or visit certain locations after dark. This is not folklore in the sense of quaint stories told to children. This is living tradition, a set of practiced beliefs that shape behavior and perception. Within this framework, the Wai-Feikai supernatural beings that range from the mischievous to the malevolent occupy a particular place. The word Wai-Feikai itself is difficult to translate precisely. It encompasses demons, monsters, spirits, and phenomena that defy natural explanation. Some Wai-Feikai are ancient, their origins lost in the mists of the Heian period 1,000 years ago. Others are newer, born from more recent fears and anxieties. The scholar Komatsu Kazuhiko, writing in the 1990s about the nature of Japanese supernatural belief, argues that Wai-Feikai serve as a language for articulating social anxieties. a way of giving shape to the shapeless dread that accompanies moments of cultural transformation. They are, in his formulation, crystallizations of fear. In the late 1970s, Japan was ripe for a new crystallization. The economic miracle had come with a cost. The traditional family structure, the childcare was shared among grandparents, parents, women, who had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the post-war period, faced intense pressure to balance career ambitions with traditional expectations of marriage and motherhood. Children, subjected to an increasingly rigorous and competitive education system, spent long hours in school and juku cram schools, often returning home to empty apartments, because both parents worked late. The old social bonds had weakened, the new ones had not yet fully formed, and into this atmosphere of dislocation and unease, Kuchisake-onna arrived. The slit-mouthed woman is, at first encounter, almost ordinary. Almost. She appears as a young woman, typically described as being in her 20s or early 30s, dressed in contemporary clothing, most often a long coat, sometimes described as red but more frequently beige or tan. Her hair is dark and straight, falling to her shoulders or past them. Her most distinctive feature in the initial encounter is what she wears to conceal her most distinctive feature: a surgical mask covering the lower half of her face. In Japan, such masks are common, worn by people suffering from colds or allergies, a social courtesy to prevent the spread of illness. The mask, therefore, allows her to blend in, to appear as just another pedestrian on a nighttime street. But the mask is not preventing contagion, it is hiding desecration. When she asks her question, "Watashi kirei?" Am I pretty? And receives an answer, she removes the mask. Her mouth has been cut from ear to ear, a grotesque Glasgow smile that splits her face into a permanent rictus grin. The wound is described in accounts as red and raw, sometimes bleeding, sometimes sewn with rough stitches, sometimes simply gaping. The sight of it is said to freeze the witness, to short-circuit the ability to run or scream. What happens next depends on how you answered her initial question, but the variations offer only the illusion of choice. In the most common version of the legend, if you say yes, affirming that she is pretty, she removes her mask and asks again, even now, Kawar demo. The revelation of the mutilated mouth makes the first answer seem like mockery. How can she be pretty with such a wound? If you answer yes again, she may laugh and walk away, or she may follow you home. Or in darker versions, she may slash your mouth to match hers, so that you too will wear a permanent smile. If you answer no to the second question, or if you answered no to the first question, in some versions she produces a large pair of scissors, the weapon of domesticity turned lethal, and stabs you repeatedly. In others she uses a scalpel or a knife. In still others, the method of death is not specified. The victim is simply found later. You are so becomes cape. If you offer her candy, specifically hard candy, she will pause to accept it, and the victim can run while she is distracted. If you say you have an appointment and you are late, she will apologize for detaining you and let you go. The Japanese cultural emphasis on politeness and obligation overriding even supernatural malevolence. But these escape routes feel arbitrary, folkloric variants introduced to give the story the structure of a puzzle to be solved. The deeper truth of Kuchisake-onna is that there is no good answer. The question, "Am I pretty?" is a trap. A test that cannot be passed because it is not really a question about appearance. It is a question about honesty, about flattery, about the social performance that women are expected to maintain and that others are expected to validate. The slit mouth transforms beauty into horror, revelation into punishment. The mask is the social face. The wound beneath is what the social face conceals. And once the mask comes off, once you have seen what lies beneath, you cannot unsee it. You are implicated. His contamination descriptions of Kuchisake-onna's abilities vary. Multiple witnesses in 1979 reported that she could keep pace with a running child, or even a car traveling at moderate speed. She appears and disappears without apparent transition, present one moment and gone the next, with no indication of where she came from or where she went. She seems to have a particular interest in children and young people, appearing near schools and parks, though she will confront adults as well. She operates at night, almost exclusively, appearing in the hours between dusk and dawn. Some accounts grant her the ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting either that there are multiple slit-mouthed women or that the entity exists outside normal physical constraints. Her voice is soft, almost hypnotic, compelling the victim to answer, even when instinct screams to run. And she is drawn, in some ineffable way, to those who are alone, who have separated from the group, who have let their guard down. The origin of Kuchisake-onna, like most urban legends, is contested, with multiple versions circulating, and no clear original source. The most common origin story, the one that appeared most frequently in the 1979 Panic, tells of a woman in the Edo period 1603–1868, who was married to a samurai. She was exceptionally beautiful and knew it, and her vanity allegedly drove her to infidelity. When her husband discovered her affair, he punished her in a manner designed to destroy the source of her power. He took his katana and slit her mouth from ear to ear, transforming her beautiful face into a mask of horror, and asked her, "Who will think you are pretty now?" She died from the wound, or from despair, or from suicide. The versions differ, but her vengeful spirit remained, bound to the world by rage and shame, compelled to repeat the question that had destroyed her. Am I pretty? In asking it, she forces others to confront the same impossible contradiction she faced, that beauty is both essential and meaningless, that it is demanded and then punished, that there is no answer that does not lead to destruction. Another version, less common, but perhaps older, attributes the origin to a medical procedure gone wrong. A woman underwent surgery. Some versions say cosmetic surgery, others say treatment for an infection or injury, and the physician, either through incompetence or malice, botched the procedure, leaving her mouth permanently mutilated. She died cursing the doctor and all who had judged her by her appearance, and her ghost now haunts the living, spreading the disfigurement that destroyed her life. This version lacks the explicit moral dimension of the unfaithful wife narrative, replacing it with body horror and medical dread, the fear of entrusting one's body to another's hands and having that trust betrayed. Yet a third tradition, mentioned in some pre-negative 1979 folklore collections, associates the slit-mouthed woman with the Kuchisake criminal punishment practiced in ancient Japan, in which convicted criminals had their mouths slit as a mark of shame. In this version, Kuchisake-onna is not a single individual, but an amalgam of all who suffered this punishment, their collective rage and humiliation given supernatural form. The punishment was applied particularly to women convicted of adultery or prostitution, crimes of the body judged and marked upon the body. The truth, if such a thing can be said to exist for a legend, is likely that Kuchisake-onna is a composite figure, drawing on multiple traditions and anxieties. Elements of her story echo older Japanese supernatural entities. The Futakuchi-onna, or two-mouthed woman, is a wai-fei-kai in which a woman develops a second mouth on the back of her head, often as punishment for stinginess or cruelty. The Yuki-onna, or snow woman, appears as a beautiful woman in a white kimono who asks travelers for help, then kills them with her icy breath. The Rokorokubi, women whose necks stretch to impossible lengths at night, prowling for prey while their bodies sleep. All of these figures share certain traits. They appear as ordinary women until the moment of revelation. They target travelers, those who are away from the safety of home and community. They represent a transgression of natural boundaries, the human form distorted or violated, and they emerge from narratives that punish, particularly female transgression. Women who are too beautiful, too vain, too hungry, too cold, too angry. The female body as a site of horror because it is a site of anxiety. But Kuchisake-onna is also distinctly modern in a way these older wai-fei-kai are not. She wears contemporary clothing. She appears in cities, not forests or mountains. She uses modern implements, scissors, scalpels, rather than claws or teeth. And most significantly, she wears a surgical mask, a symbol of post, or Japan's obsession with hygiene, health, and the concealment of the self. The mask is modernity's gift, the ability to move through public space while remaining anonymous, to hide illness or imperfection, to maintain the social facade. Kuchisake-onna weaponizes it, turns it into the prelude to horror. The mask is not protecting society from her contamination. It is protecting her from premature discovery, allowing her to get close before the revelation. The spring of 1979 is when Kuchisake-onna ceased to be folklore and became panic. The exact starting point is difficult to pinpoint. Urban legends do not have clear genesis moments, and by the time they reach the attention of official channels, they have already been circulating through informal networks for weeks or months. But researchers generally trace the beginning of the 1979 panic to reports that began circulating in late March and early April in the Gifu prefecture, a mountainous region in central Japan. Children began coming home from school with stories of a woman in a surgical mask who had approached them on their walk home, asked if she was pretty, and then revealed a mutilated mouth. The stories spread rapidly through playground networks, that invisible but highly efficient information system through which children communicate fears, rumors, and warnings to one another. Within days, children across Gifu were terrified to walk home alone. Parents began organizing group escorts. Some schools altered their dismissal times, letting children out earlier in the afternoon when there would still be plenty of daylight and adults on the streets. The Japanese media, monitoring police reports and responding to concerned parents, began running stories about the slit-mouthed woman's sightings. Newspapers published articles with headlines like, "The Mysterious Woman Terrifying Children," and "Urban Legend or Real Threat." Television news programs interviewed frightened children and concerned parents. The coverage was typically cautious, noting that police had received numerous reports but had not confirmed any actual attacks. No child had been physically harmed. No one had been found with their mouth slit. There were only the sightings, the encounters that ended with the woman vanishing or the child running away. But the absence of confirmed harm did not diminish the fear. If anything, it amplified it. The threat was everywhere and nowhere. It was possible and unproven. And the media coverage, intended to inform and perhaps to reassure, instead spread the story far beyond Gifu. By late April 1979, Kuchisake-onna sightings were being reported across Japan. The panic followed a predictable geographic pattern, spreading from Gifu outward along transportation corridors and communication networks, jumping to major cities, Nagoya, Osaka, Tokyo, and then filtering into surrounding towns and suburbs. The speed of the spread reflected both Japan's highly connected media environment and the particular vulnerability of children to such narratives. Children who had heard about Kuchisake-onna were primed to see her. A woman in a surgical mask became a potential threat. An innocent question became the prelude to horror. The power of suggestion transformed ordinary encounters into supernatural ones, and each new report reinforced the belief that the threat was real. In some communities, the panic reached extraordinary levels. Schools in multiple prefectures sent letters home to parents warning them about the rumor of the slit-mouthed woman and advising that children be escorted home in groups. Some schools stationed teachers at gates and along common routes to monitor students' safe passage. Police in several cities increased patrols in the late afternoon and early evening hours, the times when children would be walking home. In a few extreme cases, parents simply kept their children home from school, unwilling to risk even a monitored walk home. The Japanese National Police Agency, responding to the volume of reports and the intensity of public concern, issued a statement in early May 1979, attempting to calm the panic. The statement noted that police had investigated numerous reported sightings, but had found no evidence of an actual attacker. No victims had come forward with physical injuries. No witnesses had provided consistent descriptions beyond the basic elements of the legend. A woman, a mask, a question. The police suggested that the reports were likely the result of mass hysteria, a phenomenon in which fear and suggestion create the perception of a threat that does not objectively exist. The statement was factually accurate. It was also largely ineffective. The logic of urban legend does not operate on the principle of empirical verification. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that no one has been caught does not mean no one is out there, and the police statement, by acknowledging the reports seriously enough to issue an official response, paradoxically validated the belief that there was something to respond to. The 1979 panic subsided as quickly as it had risen. By June, reports of Kuchisake-onna sightings had dropped to a trickle, and by summer, the story had largely disappeared from the news. Researchers who have studied the phenomenon attribute the rapid decline to several factors. First, the approach of summer vacation meant that children were no longer walking home from school at the same predictable times and routes, disrupting the circumstances under which encounters were most likely to be reported. Second, the sustained absence of any confirmed attack or victim gradually eroded the sense of immediate threat. Fear sustained at high intensity cannot be maintained indefinitely without reinforcement. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the media moved on to other stories, and without media amplification, the panic lost its social momentum. But Kuchisake-onna did not disappear. She retreated back into the substrate of urban legend, waiting. The 1979 panic did not occur in a cultural vacuum, and to understand how a ghost story could grip an entire nation, one must examine how Western observers encountered, interpreted, and transformed Japanese folklore more broadly. The history of Western engagement with Japanese supernatural tradition is a history of translation in the most literal and metaphorical sense, a process of rendering one culture's fears and beliefs into another culture's language and framework, inevitably distorting in the process. Japan's opening to the West in the mid-19th century, following more than 2 centuries of near-total isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, created a sudden flood of cultural exchange in both directions. Western observers, diplomats, merchants, missionaries, and adventurers arrived in Japan, hungry for the exotic, and they found in Japanese art, architecture, and folklore a treasure trove of material that seemed to confirm their preconceptions of the Orient as a place of mystery and strangeness. Among the most influential of these early interpreters was Lafcadio Hearn, a Greek-Irish journalist and folklorist who arrived in Japan in 1890 and spent the remaining 14 years of his life there, eventually taking Japanese citizenship under the name Koizumi Yakumo. Hearn's collections of Japanese ghost stories, particularly Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, published in 1904, just after his death, introduced English-speaking audiences to Wi-Fi Kai, Wi-Fi Ray, ghosts and the broader landscape of Japanese supernatural belief. Hearn wrote with genuine respect and affection for his adopted culture, and his work remains valuable for preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. But his translations were also adaptations, shaped by his own literary sensibilities and his awareness of what would resonate with Western readers. He emphasized the aesthetic and atmospheric elements of the stories, their melancholy beauty and understated horror, while often stripping away the specific cultural contexts that gave them meaning. The result was a kind of beautiful exoticism, Japanese folklore rendered as art object rather than lived tradition. The pattern Hearn established, respectful but ultimately appropriative, fascinated but ultimately othering, continued through much of the 20th century. Academic folklorists and anthropologists, particularly after World War II, began to study Japanese supernatural tradition with more rigor and cultural sensitivity. The Japanese scholar Yanagita Kunio, often called the father of Japanese folklore studies, worked throughout the early and mid-20th century to document and preserve local traditions, arguing that folklore was not primitive superstition but a window into the beliefs and values of ordinary people. His work, Teifei no Monogatari, published in 1910, collected stories from rural northern Japan. Yanagita's approach influenced a generation of Japanese and international scholars who sought to understand folklore in its own terms, rather than through the lens of Western rationalism. Yet even sympathetic scholarship could not escape the power dynamics inherent in the act of documentation. To record a tradition is to fix it, to transform a living, evolving set of practices into a text. And texts, once created, take on lives of their own, circulating far from their points of origin, interpreted and reinterpreted by readers who have no connection to the communities that created them. The American occupation of Japan following World War II created another layer of cross-cultural contact and misunderstanding. American soldiers stationed in Japan encountered local folklore through fragments, stories told by Japanese friends or lovers, temples and shrines, visited as tourist attractions, festivals observed but not understood. Some brought these stories home, where they circulated as exotic souvenirs of time spent in a foreign land. The anthropologist Carmen Blacker, writing in her 1975 study, The Catalpa Bow, a study of shamanistic practices in Japan, noted that American and European observers often struggled to take Japanese supernatural belief seriously, viewing it either as charming local color or as evidence of cultural backwardness. Even scholars who approached the subject with intellectual rigor tended to frame it in Western categories, comparing Waifikai to European fairies and demons, analyzing shamanic practices through the lens of psychology rather than theology, that flattened the distinct character of Japanese tradition. The language itself presented barriers. Many Japanese supernatural concepts have no direct English equivalents. Kami, often translated as gods or spirits, is neither. Waifikai, rendered as demons or monsters, encompasses entities that are often more mischievous than malevolent, more liminal than evil. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence that suffuses much of Japanese aesthetics and folklore, has no single word English translation. To translate is to approximate, and approximation is loss. The 1979 Kuchisake-onna panic caught Western observers largely by surprise. The story circulated briefly in English-language media, typically framed as an amusing or puzzling example of mass hysteria in modern Japan. A brief article in the Los Angeles Times in June 1979, citing wire service reports, described the panic as an outbreak of urban legend that has terrified schoolchildren across Japan. Treating it with a mixture of amusement and condescension, the tone implied that such irrational fears were unexpected in a technologically advanced society, revealing an assumption that modernization should have banished belief in the supernatural. The article made no attempt to explore the cultural roots of the legend, or to consider why it might have resonated so powerfully in that particular moment. It was simply a curiosity, proof that even rational, modern societies could fall prey to primitive fears. This dismissive framing obscured what Japanese observers understood, that the panic was not a regression to pre-modern belief, but a distinctly modern phenomenon, a traditional narrative structure adapted to express contemporary anxieties. The real explosion of Kuchisake-onna into Western consciousness would not come until decades later, in the early 21st century, through channels that the 1979 panic could never have anticipated. The internet, international film distribution, and the global circulation of Japanese popular culture. But the seeds were planted in those early encounters, in the translations and mistranslations, that shaped how Western audiences understood Japanese folklore. The pattern was clear: fascination with the exotic appropriation of aesthetic elements, stripping away of cultural context, and reimagining of the tradition to serve Western narrative purposes. Kuchisake-onna would follow this pattern precisely. But first, she had to become real in the imagination of Japan itself, through the documented encounters that gave the legend the weight of evidence. The documented cases of Kuchisake-onna encounters are, by their nature, difficult to verify. This is the essential paradox of urban legend. The lack of verifiable evidence is part of what defines it as legend, yet the accumulation of reports, testimonies, and near misses gives it a kind of documentary weight that feels, if not real, then at least substantial. The 1979 panic generated hundreds of reports, but most were second-hand or third-hand. A friend of a friend, a cousin in another prefecture, someone's older brother who saw her, direct witnesses. Those willing to go on record with their names and specific details were far fewer. Yet some cases did receive documentation, either through police reports, media interviews, or later investigations by folklorists and researchers. These cases form the core evidence for those who believe Kuchisake-onna was something more than mass hysteria, as well as the case studies for those who seek to understand how such legends spread and why they resonate. One of the earliest documented reports that fits the Kuchisake-onna pattern comes from April 1979 in the city of Himeji in Hyogo Prefecture. southwest of Osaka. According to a report filed with the Himeji Police Department on the 15th of April 1979, a 9-year-old girl was walking home from school at approximately 4:30 p.m. when she was approached by a woman wearing a beige coat and surgical mask. The woman asked the child if she was pretty. The girl, confused and frightened by the question from a stranger, did not answer and began to walk faster. The woman kept pace with her, repeating the question, "Am I pretty?" The child ran the remaining distance home and told her mother, who called the police. The police report notes that the officer who took the statement found the child credible, but also noted that there was no physical contact, no threat, and no crime. The woman's behavior was strange but not illegal. The case was filed as suspicious person and closed. The Himeji report is significant because it predates the peak of the media panic and because it includes specific details: the time, the location, the child's description of the woman that would become standard elements of later reports. In Tokyo, the Metropolitan Police Department recorded at least 37 reports of Kuchisake-onna sightings between May 1 and May 15, 1979. Most of these reports followed a similar pattern. A child or young teenager, usually walking alone or in a small group, encounters a woman in a surgical mask who asks about her appearance. In some cases, the woman removes her mask to reveal a disfigured mouth. In others, the children run before the mask is removed. Several reports describe the woman as moving with unusual speed, able to keep up with running children, or appearing suddenly in locations where she should not have been able to reach. The Metropolitan Police issued an internal memo on May 16, 1979, noting that all reports under investigation had failed to produce physical evidence of an attacker, and recommending that officers treat new reports as likely influenced by media coverage and mass suggestion. The memo acknowledged that the fear was real, even if the threat was not, and advised officers to respond with sensitivity to children's reports, while also gently suggesting to parents that the phenomenon was likely psychological rather than criminal. Outside major cities, the reports took on regional variations that reflected local folklore traditions. In Fukushima Prefecture, in northeastern Japan, reports from May 1979 describe a woman who appears near bridges and asks travelers if they can help her find something she has lost. When they agree to help, she removes her mask and asks if they find her pretty. Several witnesses reported that she smelled of water and decay, attributes associated with the kappa, a water-dwelling waifukai from Japanese folklore. In Okinawa Prefecture, the southernmost islands of Japan with their own distinct cultural traditions, reports describe a woman whose mouth wounds are described specifically as punishment cuts, kuchisake, linking the figure to older penal traditions. These regional variations suggest that Kuchisake-onna was not a single monolithic legend, but a framework onto which different communities projected their own specific fears and traditions. The core elements remained constant: the woman, the mask, the question, the mouth, but the details refracted through local lenses. The most extensively documented case from the 1979 panic comes from the city of Nagoya in Aichi Prefecture, and was investigated by the folklorist Matsuoka Kunio, who published his findings in a 1981 pascals per 4, the journal Japanese Journal of Folklore Studies. On May 8, 1979, 5 children between the ages of 8 and 11 were walking home together from elementary school when they encountered a woman matching the Kuchisake-onna description. The woman was standing at an intersection they had to cross, directly in their path. When they approached, she asked them, "Am I pretty?" The children, who had all heard stories about Kuchisake-onna from classmates and media coverage, immediately recognized the danger. One of them shouted, "We're late for our appointments," one of the escape phrases from the legend, and they ran in the opposite direction, taking a longer route home. The next day, 2 of the children reported the encounter to a teacher, who contacted the parents and then the police. By the time the police investigated, 3 days had passed, and no physical evidence remained. Matsuoka interviewed all 5 children separately in June 1979. He found their accounts remarkably consistent regarding the core details: the woman's appearance, her question, their response, their flight, but noted discrepancies in peripheral details, like the exact time, the color of the woman's coat, and whether she had followed them when they ran. Matsuoka concluded that the children had indeed encountered a woman who asked them an unusual question. but he argued that their interpretation of the encounter as supernatural was shaped by their prior exposure to the legend. In other words, the encounter was real. The identification of the woman as Kuchisake-onna was constructed. Several reports from the 1979 panic describe encounters that ended with the woman revealing her mutilated mouth. The detail that separates casual strangeness from horror. On May 12, 1979, a 14-year-old boy in Saitama Prefecture reported to police that he had been approached by a woman on his bicycle ride home from cram school at approximately 9 p.m. The woman stepped into his path, forcing him to stop, and asked if she was pretty. She removed her mask, revealed a mouth slit from ear to ear, and asked again, "Even now?" The boy, according to his report, was so shocked that he fell from his bicycle. He got up and ran, leaving the bicycle behind. When he returned the next morning with his father to retrieve it, the bicycle was still there. The boy described the woman's mouth as sewn with black thread and wet, like it was still bleeding. Police investigated, but found no suspect. The boy's description of the wound was consistent with descriptions in other reports, suggesting either that witnesses were drawing on a shared template or that they were describing a real and consistent injury. When asked by police if the woman said anything after revealing her face, the boy said she had laughed, a high, thin sound that he described as not human. Not all reports came from children. On May 18, 1979, a taxi driver in Osaka reported picking up a female passenger at approximately 11 p.m. who wore a surgical mask and asked to be taken to an address in a residential neighborhood. During the ride, according to the driver's statement to police, the woman asked him if he thought she was pretty. The driver, uncomfortable with the question from a stranger, said he could not see her face because of the mask. The woman said, "Would you like to?" and began to reach for the mask. The driver, who had heard the Kuchisake-onna stories, accelerated and drove directly to the nearest police station, approximately 2 kilometers away. When he arrived and turned around, the passenger was gone. The back door was still closed. The fare had not been paid. The driver admitted he could not explain how she had left the moving vehicle, but insisted that she had been real, that he had not imagined her. Police examined the taxi and found no evidence of the passenger, no fingerprints on the door handles, no hairs on the seat. The driver was adamant and sober, with no history of mental illness or dishonesty. The case was filed as unsolved. The accumulation of these reports, none individually conclusive, but collectively forming a pattern, created a dilemma for authorities. If Kuchisake-onna was not real, then either hundreds of witnesses were lying, unlikely, hallucinating, implausible, or misinterpreting ordinary encounters through the lens of mass suggestion, most probable. But the psychological explanation, while rational, did not fully account for the consistency of certain details across geographically separated reports, particularly descriptions of the wound itself and the woman's unusual speed. Some investigators and folklorists proposed compromise theories. Perhaps there was a real woman, possibly mentally ill or deliberately exploiting the legend for her own purposes, who had been moving through different regions and staging encounters that fed the panic. Perhaps there were multiple women, copycats inspired by media coverage. Perhaps some encounters were genuine while others were misidentifications or fabrications. These explanations had the virtue of acknowledging both the reality of the fear and the absence of confirmed violence. But they also highlighted the difficulty of definitively proving or disproving an urban legend. The legend exists in the space between the confirmed and the impossible, and that ambiguous space is precisely its power. The 1979 panic generated one final category of documentation: the analysis by academics and media observers, attempting to explain the phenomenon. In July 1979, the sociologist Inoue Hisashi published an article in the journal Shakai Kagaku, Social Science, titled "The Kuchisake-onna Phenomenon: Mass Hysteria in Modern Japan." Inoue argued that the panic reflected anxieties about the rapid social changes of the 1970s, particularly the breakdown of traditional community structures and the increasing isolation of nuclear families. Children, who in previous generations would have walked home in large groups with older siblings and neighborhood friends, now often walked alone or in pairs, making them more vulnerable to perceived threats. The figure of the slit-mouthed woman, Inoue suggested, embodied fears about strangers, about the hidden dangers lurking in urban anonymity, and about the violence that could erupt when social norms broke down. The mask in his analysis represented the social facade that everyone maintains, and its removal represented the fear of what lies beneath the surface of ordinary interactions. Inoue's analysis was widely cited and became the standard academic interpretation of the 1979 panic, but it also reflected a certain dismissiveness toward the actual content of the legend, treating it as merely a vehicle for more legitimate social anxieties, rather than as meaningful in itself. The journalist and cultural critic Kuroiwa Shino offered a feminist reading in an essay published in the women's magazine Fujin Keifaran. Kuroiwa argued that Kuchisake-onna should be understood as a manifestation of women's rage in a society that valued them primarily for their appearance and then punished them for that same appearance. The slit mouth, she wrote, was a visualization of the double bind. Women are told they must be beautiful, but beauty invites unwanted attention, objectification, and violence. The woman's question, "Am I pretty?" forces the viewer to participate in the judgment that destroyed her. There is no safe answer because the question itself is violence. Kuroiwa connected the legend to contemporary discussions of sexual harassment, domestic violence, and the pressures of Japan's beauty industry. Her essay was controversial, with critics arguing that she was imposing modern feminist theory onto a traditional ghost story. But it resonated with many women readers who saw in Kuchisake-onna something of their own experiences, navigated through hostile urban spaces, managing the male gaze, and feeling that their value was perpetually under judgment. The legend in this reading was not about children's fears, but about women's reality. These analytical frameworks, sociological, feminist, psychological, all sought to explain Kuchisake-onna by explaining her away, by reducing the legend to symptom of something else. They were not wrong, exactly. Urban legends do reflect social anxieties. Symbols do carry meaning. Stories are shaped by the cultures that tell them. But the analyses also missed something essential. The legend's power lies not only in what it represents, but in what it is. A story about a mutilated woman who asks an unanswerable question and punishes all responses. A figure who moves too fast, appears in impossible places, and vanishes without trace. A presence that transforms ordinary spaces. A walk home from school. A late night taxi ride. A quiet intersection into stages for potential horror. The legend works because it operates on the level of primal fear, the dread of the uncanny encounter, before it reaches the level of interpretation. And that fear, once activated, does not require belief in literal ghosts to be real. The transformation of Kuchisake-onna from Japanese urban legend to global pop culture phenomenon occurred gradually over the late 20th and early 21st centuries, following the well-worn path by which folkloric traditions are adapted, commercialized, and reimagined for mass entertainment. The 1979 panic had made her a household name in Japan, but outside Japan, she remained largely unknown until the 1990s, when increasing Western interest in Japanese horror and the rise of internet culture created the conditions for her international spread. The process was not simply one of transmission, but of transformation. Each medium that adopted her, literature, film, video games, manga, anime, reshaped her according to its own logic and audience expectations, stripping away some elements while amplifying others, until the global Kuchisake-onna bore only partial resemblance to the figure that had terrified Japanese schoolchildren 2 decades earlier. The earliest significant appearance of Kuchisake-onna in Japanese popular culture came in the immediate aftermath of the 1979 panic. The manga artist Umezu Kazuo, known for his horror comics, incorporated a Kuchisake-onna-like figure into his 1981 series Orochi, which serialized in the girls' manga magazine, Shate Feijo Friend. Umezu's version, while not explicitly named Kuchisake-onna, featured many of the legend's core elements. A beautiful woman who reveals a hidden disfigurement, a question that traps the victim, and a punishment for the wrong answer. Umezu's genius was in understanding that the horror of Kuchisake-onna was not in gore but in the violation of social expectations. His manga played on the contrast between the woman's initial beauty and the shock of revelation, using the medium's visual language, panel layouts that controlled pacing, close-ups that emphasized facial expressions, gutters that allowed readers' imagination to fill in the worst moments to heighten the psychological horror. The manga was popular but not exceptional. Kuchisake-onna was one horror motif among many in the rich ecosystem of Japanese horror comics, but it established her as legitimate material for commercial exploitation, a figure who could be adapted and sold. The first significant film adaptation came with Carved, the slit-mouthed woman Kuchisake-onna, released in 2007, and directed by Shiraishi Keifeiji. The film came at the tail end of what scholars call the J-horror boom, the period from roughly 1998 to 2008 when Japanese horror films gained international recognition and commercial success, driven by films like Ring 1998, Ju-on, The Grudge 2002, and Dark Water 2002. These films established a distinctly Japanese approach to horror that Western critics often characterized as slow, burning, atmospheric, and rooted in folklore and spiritual tradition. In contrast to the more visceral, immediate horror of American slasher films, Carved attempted to capitalize on this aesthetic and audience interest while updating the Kuchisake-onna legend for contemporary sensibilities. The film's plot involved a small town where children begin disappearing, and two teachers investigate, uncovering connections to a woman who was abused and mutilated decades earlier, and whose vengeful spirit now preys on children. The film made several significant changes to the traditional legend. It provided a specific tragic backstory for the woman. It relocated her from urban streets to a small town, trading the anonymity of the city for the claustrophobia of a close-knit community. And it made her explicitly murderous, with on-screen violence and child victims, escalating the stakes far beyond the ambiguous encounters of the 1979 reports. Carved was a moderate commercial success in Japan and received international distribution, introducing Kuchisake-onna to horror fans who had never heard the original legend. Western reviews were mixed. Critics praised the film's atmosphere and the performance of Sato Eriko as the slit-mouthed woman, but many found the plot convoluted and the scares derivative of better-known Jane horror films. The English-language horror website Bloody Disgusting gave it a middling review, noting that while Carved has its moments, it never quite escapes the shadow of the films it is clearly trying to emulate. What the reviews missed, however, was the cultural significance of the adaptation itself. The film took a legend rooted in very specific Japanese anxieties about beauty, social performance, and the dangers of urban anonymity, and translated it into a more generic horror narrative about abuse, revenge, and the sins of the past. The question, "Am I pretty?" remained, but it lost much of its cultural weight, becoming merely a creepy line of dialogue rather than a test with social and moral implications. The mask, so central to the legend's Japanese context, became just another horror movie prop. The film was Kuchisake-onna, but it was also not Kuchisake. Was a translation that had become something else. The international spread of Kuchisake-onna accelerated with the rise of internet horror culture in the 2000s. Websites dedicated to urban legends, creepypasta forums, and YouTube channels devoted to horror storytelling discovered the slit-mouthed woman as a fresh and exotic alternative to Western favorites, like Bloody Mary or The Vanishing Hitchhiker. The legend was particularly well suited to internet dissemination. It was short, visceral, and adaptable. Versions began circulating in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and other languages, often stripped of their Japanese context, and relocated to generic urban settings. The website Television Tropes, a collaborative wiki cataloging narrative conventions, added Kuchisake-onna to its urban legend and stringy-haired ghost girl pages, categorizing her alongside other figures from global horror tradition. YouTube creators produced videos with titles like The Terrifying Japanese Legend of the Slit-Mouthed Woman and Kuchisake-onna, Would You Survive? These videos typically followed a standard format: a thumbnail image of a woman with a grotesque mouth wound, often using makeup or Photoshop rather than historical imagery, a narration explaining the legend, speculation about real encounters, and a discussion of how to survive if one met her. The production values varied wildly, from professional documentary-style presentations to teenagers recording in their bedrooms. But the cumulative effect was enormous reach. A legend that had been contained within Japan for decades now circulated globally, mutating with each retelling. Video games adopted Kuchisake-onna as both antagonist and ambient horror. The Forbidden Siren series, developed by Sony Computer Entertainment and released beginning in 2003, featured Shibito revenants inspired by Japanese folklore, including figures resembling Kuchisake-onna. The games emphasized atmosphere and vulnerability, with players controlling ordinary people rather than combat, ready heroes, forced to hide and evade rather than fight. The 2015 indie horror game Dreadout, developed by Digital Happiness in Indonesia, included a Kuchisake-onna-inspired ghost as one of its main antagonists. The game's international setting, it took place in Indonesia, but drew on horror traditions from across Asia, reflected how Kuchisake-onna had become part of a broader regional horror vocabulary, no longer exclusively Japanese, but part of a shared Asian horror imaginary. Players encountering the character had to answer her question correctly or face in-game death, translating the legend's central dilemma into game mechanics. The gamification of Kuchisake-onna completed a transformation that had been underway for decades. From folklore to entertainment, from cultural expression to consumable content, from warning to challenge. Perhaps the most significant recent adaptation came with the 2019 South Korean film 0.0 MHz, which, while not directly about Kuchisake-onna, included her as one of several vengeful spirits encountered by the protagonists. The film's international release on streaming platforms gave it a reach that theatrical releases rarely achieve, and it introduced the legend to audiences who might never have sought out Japanese horror specifically. The inclusion of Kuchisake-onna in a South Korean production also illustrated how she had become a regional, rather than purely national figure, part of the shared horror vocabulary of East Asia. This regionalization mirrored historical patterns in which cultural traditions spread along trade routes and linguistic zones, but the speed was unprecedented. A legend born in 1970s Japan had become recognizable from Tokyo to Seoul to Jakarta to Manila within a generation. Western adaptations tended to emphasize the body horror aspects, while diminishing the psychological and social dimensions. American and European horror fans encountering Kuchisake-onna through internet culture often compared her to slasher villains like Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger, supernatural killers with distinctive appearances and modus operandi. This comparison was not entirely wrong. Kuchisake-onna does share structural similarities with slasher antagonists, but it missed the fundamental difference. Slasher villains are external threats, forces of chaos attacking from outside the social order. Kuchisake-onna emerges from within the social order, from its contradictions and cruelties. She is not other. She is us, distorted. The question she asks is not a prelude to random violence, but a demand for social performance. A test that exposes the impossibility of navigating female existence in a society that both demands and punishes beauty. When that dimension was lost, as it often was in Western adaptations, Kuchisake-onna became just another monster, scary but not meaningful. Yet for all the dilution and commercialization, the core image retained its power. The woman in the surgical mask asking if she is pretty. The moment of revelation, the impossible choice. These elements transcended cultural boundaries because they tapped into fears that, while shaped by specific contexts, resonate universally. The fear of deceptive appearances, the fear of being judged, the fear that beneath the social mask everyone wears, there is something wounded and furious. The legend had traveled far from the spring of 1979, but it carried something essential with it, something that no amount of adaptation could completely erase. There is a question worth asking. Now, as we stand decades past the original panic and watch Kuchisake-onna's image circulate endlessly through the machinery of global media, what does she mean now? What does it? The answer, perhaps, lies in understanding what has changed and what has not. The technologies of 2026 are unrecognizable compared to 1979. The social media landscape through which contemporary urban legends spread would seem like science fiction to the Japanese schoolchildren who first reported Kuchisake-onna sightings. Yet the fundamental dynamics that give urban legends their power The way fear spreads through networks, the human tendency to see patterns and meaning in ambiguity, the need to give form to formless dread, these remain constant. Kuchisake-onna has endured not despite modernization, but because of it. Because each new technological regime creates new anxieties that require new stories, or old stories in new forms. Consider the surgical mask, that central symbol of the legend. In 1979, it marked Kuchisake-onna as distinctly Japanese, the mask being far more common in Japan than in Western countries. The mask allowed her to hide in plain sight, to move through public spaces unnoticed, because masked faces were unremarkable. It was a symbol of Japanese cultural norms around hygiene, privacy, and social consideration. Then came 2020, and suddenly, the entire world understood mask culture in a way it never had before. The COVID-19 pandemic made surgical masks a global phenomenon, transforming them from a Japanese peculiarity into a universal symbol of the early 2020s. Overnight, Kuchisake-onna's mask ceased to be exotic and became familiar, even mundane. Yet this familiarity did not diminish the horror. If anything, it amplified it. During the pandemic years, people across the world experienced what Japanese children had felt in 1979. The unease of not being able to see others' faces fully. The way masks created anonymity even in close proximity. The difficulty of reading intention and emotion when half the face is hidden. The mask became simultaneously protection and threat, necessity and concealment. Kuchisake-onna, who had worn a mask to hide horror, suddenly seemed less like a relic of Japanese folklore and more like a prophecy of global experience. The question at the heart of the legend, "Am I pretty?" has likewise found new resonance in the age of social media, selfie culture, and the algorithmic curation of appearance. The platforms that dominate contemporary life are, at their core, engines for the commodification and judgment of appearance. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and their countless variants and successors all operate on the premise that one's image can and should be presented for evaluation by strangers. That likes and comments and shares constitute a form of validation or condemnation. The filters and editing tools built into these platforms allow users to construct idealized versions of themselves, to hide blemishes and smooth skin and adjust proportions, to wear, in effect, a digital mask that shows only what one wishes to show. But the mask does not protect. It creates an expectation that the reality beneath must be hidden, because it cannot measure up to the constructed ideal. Teenage girls and young women, in particular, report epidemic levels of anxiety around appearance, driven in part by the constant comparison to algorithmically curated images that represent impossible standards. The question, "Am I pretty?" is no longer asked by a ghost on a darkened street, but by an app, a platform, an invisible algorithm that determines whose content gets promoted and whose gets buried. And just as in the legend, there is no safe answer. To say yes is to invite objectification, unwanted attention, and the pressure to maintain an unsustainable image. To say no is to accept invisibility, irrelevance, the sense of not measuring up. To refuse to answer, to opt out of the game entirely, is to risk social marginalization. In a world where digital presence increasingly determines Kuchisake's chrysanthem's, her slit mouth is the wound that beauty culture inflicts, the damage that remains when the mask of social acceptability is removed. Her question is the question that consumer capitalism asks constantly. Are you pretty? Are you thin enough? Young enough? Do you measure up? And her punishment for the wrong answer reflects the real penalties that women face for failing to navigate these contradictions successfully. Violence, marginalization, erasure, or the transformation into something monstrous. The legend is horror, yes, but it is also allegory, a story that makes visible the invisible violence of everyday expectations. There is also something in the legend that speaks to broader anxieties about authenticity and deception, in an age of deepfakes, filtered images, and artificial intelligence. The woman in the mask represents the fear that surfaces do not reveal reality, that what presents as safe or normal might conceal horror. This fear has ancient roots. It is the fear of the trickster, the shapeshifter, the monster in human form. But it takes on new dimensions in an era when digital manipulation makes it increasingly difficult to trust what one sees. Kuchisake-onna asks us to look at her, to judge her appearance. But the premise of the legend is that appearance is precisely what cannot be trusted. The mask hides the mouth, but the mouth itself is a form of mask. A wound that transforms the face into something that seems human, but is not quite. A violation of the boundaries that define the person. The question of what is real and what is performance, what is genuine and what is constructed, runs through the legend and through contemporary discourse about online identity, AI-generated content, and the increasing difficulty of distinguishing authentic human expression from its simulations. Yet, for all these contemporary resonances, there remains something irreducibly old in Kuchisake-onna, something that connects her to the ancient lineage of female monsters in global mythology. The mutilated woman who seeks revenge is not a new archetype. Medusa, whose gaze turned men to stone, was beautiful before Athena transformed her as punishment for being raped by Poseidon. La Llorona, the weeping woman of Latin American legend, drowned her children and now wanders eternally, mourning and dangerous. Bloody Mary, summoned in bathroom mirrors by teenage girls testing their bravery, is often interpreted as a woman who died in childbirth or was murdered by a jealous partner. These figures, and countless others across cultures, share a pattern. A woman is harmed, often by male violence or patriarchal norms. She dies or is transformed. She returns as something monstrous, her victimhood transfigured into threat. The stories serve dual function. On one level, they are warnings. This is what happens to women who transgress, who are too beautiful, or too vain, or too angry. On another level, they are fantasies of female power. The victim returns, unkillable, to exact revenge on a world that destroyed her. Kuchisake-onna fits precisely into this tradition. She was beautiful, and her beauty was punished. She died, or should have died, but did not. She returns, not as victim but as threat, asking the question that destroyed her so that others might feel the impossibility she felt. She is warning and revenge, victim and monster, all at once. The legend endures. Finally, because it is adaptable, because each generation and each culture can find in it a reflection of its own fears and a language for its own anxieties. The 1979 version spoke to post-war Japanese concerns about urban anonymity and the breakdown of traditional community. The 2007 film version spoke to concerns about child abuse and the sins of previous generations. The 2020's internet version speaks to concerns about beauty standards, digital identity, and the violence of judgment. The legend is a container into which each era pours its particular dread, and the fact that the container has remained recognizable across decades and across cultures suggests that it holds something essential, some fear that transcends the specific circumstances that gave birth to it. We are afraid of being judged. We are afraid of what lies beneath surfaces. We are afraid that the answer we give to the question, "Am I pretty?" will not be the right one, because there is no right one, because the question itself is the trap. And we tell the story of Kuchisake-onna to give form to that fear, to externalize it, to make it something that can be named and discussed, and, in the telling, perhaps robbed of a fraction of its power, or perhaps, in the telling, the fear is only amplified, spread to others, given new life. Perhaps that is how urban legends work, not as exorcisms but as contagions, not as ways of mastering fear but as ways of sharing it, ensuring that no one faces the darkness alone. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.